Welcome everyone to the second in a two-part webinar hosted by the Council for Inclusive Capitalism in collaboration. Two organizations who are providing technical expertise and thought leadership in the S-Disclosure space. My name is Meredith Sumter and I'm the CEO of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, and it's really an honor to be here with you and to be joined by colleagues from SHIFT and the Foundation, as well as by experts from partner organizations for this second session on preparing for S-Disclosure, where we aim to help you explore the characteristics of good social and human capital metrics and best practices for performance evaluation. Now, before we get started, you should know that this webinar will be recorded. We will be sharing written highlights of today's webinar along with the recording of only the presentation session for today. The Q&A will not be made public. Now, we invite you to share your questions and please bring them to us by using the Q&A function in Zoom. And I know that our presenters will try to get to as many of your questions as possible during our time together. Now, at the end of today's event, we will share with you a short survey to get your feedback on the learning webinar, but also to get your thoughts on further needs you might have in preparing for S-Disclosure. This is a topic on which the host organizations aim to support you and to provide assistance and insight for private sector adoption of best practices in this space. Now let's get started. The Council for Inclusive Capitalism, we are a global community of company and investor leaders, as well as public sector organizations that value people and that believe that businesses are most successful when the broader societies and economies in which we operate are both stable and broadly prosperous. Council members believe both in taking action and in being transparent in our actions to understand their impact. We see this as critical to advancing company learnings and adoption of inclusive capitalism best practices. And it is in this spirit that the Council is organizing a learning series on S-Disclosure along with SHIFT and Thomson Reuters Foundation, and at a time of what I would call a dramatic increase in interest by both governments and society on the impact that businesses have on people. So for those of you who may not have joined Tuesday's first webinar on S-Disclosure, I want to share a few key takeaways to help frame today's discussion on good S indicators and metrics. Fundamentally, S is about people. It's about the impact and performance of companies in meeting the needs of people and the well-being of the communities and value chains that our companies are a part of. And some of the key highlights from Tuesday's discussion include points such that with social disclosure, we are looking to understand and measure and value the outcomes of business actions. Now, there are many actions companies can take that will affect individuals, groups, and broader society, but it is the outcomes of those actions that is what matters and what will drive value. And it is therefore the outcomes that we should be measuring. Now, you are all also coming to this topic at an exciting time, and there were four key points discussed Tuesday that really drive home this point. First, we are at the early stages of governments and markets truly valuing people, and you can expect increased attention and regulations in the S space, particularly as the climate and inequality-related crises deepen. Over 16% of all S-Disclosure regulations have come to the fore in just the last 2 years alone. Second, unlike in the E space, in the S space, there is a weaker causal link between company action and outcomes. Companies therefore have an important role in sharing out our actions and outcomes to help governments, investors, peer companies, and other stakeholders determine what works best. Third, there is more commonality and complementarity of all the different S measurement frameworks and methods than most realize. As Caroline Reese shared with us on Tuesday, we are using different languages often to say the same thing. And what this shows us is that there is a solid platform for onward convergence and standardization. And lastly, there is a real, and I would say underappreciated, competitive advantage to be realized for companies that pursue profit in ways that also result in both positive outcomes for people and for the communities in which they operate. This is the value creation beyond pure profit that mitigates systemic risk by contributing to the healthy economies and societies that we need as businesses to be successful. So with today's learning webinar, we will introduce you to experts who will provide clarity on best practices for corporate S disclosure and investor evaluation of companies' social performance. So now it's my true pleasure to introduce to you Julia Corinaldi, who is the Director of Inclusive Economies Programs at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Julia has over 15 years of experience in the NGO and social enterprise sector, and she is here to help us unpack some of the myths around S disclosure, as well as to provide more clarity on pragmatic actions that we all can take. Julia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Meredith. And thank you everyone for logging in today. And finally, thank you to the Counter and Shift for the partnership and commitment to social issues, and for the speaker today, which will give for sure some great insight. And as you said, on Tuesday, we agreed that the S is about the impact of business on people. And today is to try and dig a deeper and help prepare for disclosure and discuss what's a good indicators, what are the best practice for measurement. And I wanted to start with engaging with the audience and starting with a poll that if we can bring that on. Yes, perfect. So what are the key challenges? Please engage with us as we are here together for an hour. Is it because it's too difficult to assess social performance in general? There's no reliable data? Is only possible to measure social performance through qualitative, or actually it's only possible to measure through quantitative metrics that are not that great, or it's just very difficult to assess outcomes? What is your biggest challenge at the moment in your journey? And as you fill in this poll, I'm going to just give you an idea why I'm talking to you today. I'm the Director of Inclusive Economy at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, which aims to build fair, free, and informed society by fostering inclusive economy and advancing media freedom and protecting human rights. And as part of our work on inclusive economy, we're really looking at shifting business practice with responsible business practices. And so we facilitated a working group with ICFC, White & Case, Refinitiv. Please, the next slide. Sorry. And to really engage with different type of stakeholder, and we set out to really amplify the need of urgently act on social performance globally. And we consulted with over 100 stakeholders around the journey to really understand what were the blockage, what were the myths. And so we wanted to make as accessible as possible to explain how it's actually possible to get started and looking at social performance, and how you can focus on indicators that really measure outcomes rather than effect or conduct. And we use the myth-buster approach for investors specifically, but we understand that some of what we call myth are actually challenges that you're facing. But we don't want what we say, because it's too complicated, there's challenges, people use it as an excuse to actually deliver action. But actually, we believe that it's possible to start acting on it. And actually, as we demonstrated yesterday, it's important to start acting on it, given what's happening at the global level. We came out with these 5 myths that we found through the engagement around with the 100 stakeholders. And the first 2 we really addressed yesterday, and change of slide, sorry, where we really understood how it is material, it is not only relevant for impact organization, but to all businesses, because it's looking at how business affect people. And with a lot of the laws coming and regulation, it will affect the materiality of business across the value chains. So let's go back though to see if the other three myths are in line with the challenges that you voted today. Okay, we can see there's a 42% is saying, actually what's really hard is to assess the outcome. But there's a high percentage saying that it's actually difficult to assess as a whole. And there's a bit of us that is saying there's no reliability on the data, which is similar to the challenges that we looked at, that there are too, it's too difficult. We don't know where to start, how to assess it in general. As indicators are too hard to measure. There's no reliable data, and quality surveys are the best method for analyzing social performance. These were the three myths that we found. And next slide. But actually, going back to the challenges that we were saying, that you said, and the reality and the action that we found was really like, the first one is, yes, it is hard to assess and to get started, but actually the link between business and human rights is well established, and there are existing resources that you can use. Yesterday, on Tuesday, we spoke about the UN Guiding Principles for Business and how they provide an accessible roadmap for building an understanding on social issues. So you can get started somewhere to measure. And also you should get started because of the laws that are coming in place. The second is myth or challenge that people are facing is it is possible, it's around data and indicators, which today the panel will give great insight on. But what we found is that while there is a lack of standardization, out there's quite a few indicators that can measure outcome that can be used. And it's important that you pick and understand which one you can require from your suppliers and throughout your value chains, and as well as what your investors are requiring. And then it's about engagement. And so it's a mix between the data and the qualitative engagement, because as Natalie from the Coalition Capital said on Tuesday, you should base your decision on what you're observing as well as the data that you're looking, because you don't want to let the search for the perfect indicator stop you from disclosing the right information and engaging on these important issues. And so finally, I wanted to give you some actions that we put in the paper. We've already got the fact that there's some existing framework and resources, next slide, that you can use that are really for the basic starting. And you can also work with organizations like Shift that can help you assess and advise where are you at in your assessment and measurement. Secondly, in terms of action, there are useful indicators and data out there that you can use. And I believe in my journey about learning around is NGOs and working with NGOs is key. They have some data that they have developed, and they have some indicator that yesterday we looked at. Sorry, next slide. That yesterday we looked at with the IMP, but there's also like data that initiative as the World Disclosure Initiative or Wikirates can provide. And this initiative needs to be scaled up. So please engage with those and provide more data and build them up. Next slide. Another great tools to engage with social measure are benchmarks. These are examples on the slides of indices and benchmarks that are available that successfully utilize data-driven input and qualitative analysis. This can help you as a business really engage and understand what are good indicators out there, what is good practice, and what is not, and learn and integrate. And it can be as broader as the World Benchmarking Alliance or go more narrow on specific topic like loaded chain or ranking digital rights. And I think the panel today will investigate further what's a good indicator, how it works, And I will leave that to the panel, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an understanding, and you can download the paper on the chat. Next slide, where you can find all the actions and more than the one I just presented. The foundation remains committed to this topic, and we are training journalists around the world on how to report on the S and ESG, and we're training lawyers and financial controllers around the world to ensuring the laws that we're putting in place are embraced in their spirit, and that we achieve through the laws and the standards and the metric, the impact on people that we really want to achieve. And lastly, I want to extend an invite to everyone to Trust Conference, which is happening on the 26th and the 27th of October. You can find link on the chat, where we'll continue this conversation with our partners and many more around business and human rights. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to the panel for a fruitful discussion.
Giulia Corinaldi, thank you so much for sharing with us useful tools and resources and how we all can get started on practicing disclosures. And I appreciated the point made about at this stage, it's all about a combination of both a data-driven and qualitative analysis of the impact that we have in the social space. It's going to take both of that for us to really enrich and deepen our understanding of our outcomes in the social space. So I encourage all of you who have questions for Giulia, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll get to your questions shortly at the end of our next discussion session. So next, I'm delighted to introduce Mark Hodge, who is a senior associate at Shift. Mark is a key figure at Shift, which is the leading center of expertise on business getting done with respect for people's dignity. And he co-leads Shift's work to measure and improve evaluation of business respect for human rights. Mark today will be joined by Nicolaj Peterson, who's a senior manager at Principles for Responsible Investment and a recognized expert on social and human rights issues, as well as by Marte Johnson Stensrud, who is vice president at Equinor and who leads that company's work on human rights and social responsibility. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you also to Giulia. Shift is delighted to be working in partnership with the Council and TRF for these webinar series and ongoing beyond this. Thank you also for all of you for joining today. It's delightful to see sort of a widening and diverse community of individuals in various organizations leaning into this question of trying to measure S performance in a meaningful way. I think all of the research and the responses to some of those polls and the discussion on the first webinar really emphasize what we commonly hear, which is that measuring social performance is just a bit less advanced than measuring the E and measuring the G. And so we have to figure out how we find meaningful paths forward. And today's conversation for the remainder of the webinar will really be focusing on how do we move forward in a very practical way. How do we begin to think about, test and mature RS measurement? I think it's clear to say there are no silver bullets out there. We're all trying to find our path forward. And what we'll do in this conversation is really organize that into two parts. And you've heard these two things referenced already. So one is we will think about measuring conduct. In other words, we heard a lot on the last webinar about the growth of convergence of our due diligence expectations, particularly aligned to the international standards of the UN Guiding Principles and OECD guidelines. And it is important for us to understand what indicators give us insight into the quality of that due diligence and whether actually it's likely to lead to indeed better outcomes. So we'll spend part of our time focusing on this question of conduct and how do we grasp that. We will also then come to this question of outcomes, which both Meredith and Giulia referred to, and that came up on the poll as well as one of those persistent challenges that companies and indeed others struggle with. We know that measuring outcomes and having good metrics for that is important to see whether companies are contributing positively to respect for human rights, indeed to people's well-being, and perhaps more widely to human capital and social capital. And so we will approach these two things. They are slightly different measurement challenges, As we go into this, please use the Q&A function. I am delighted to be joined by two excellent practitioners who really are going to help share from their perspective what work they've been doing. Martha from Equinor, from Insider Company, and Nikolai from an investor perspective. And we're delighted, Martha and Nikolai, to have you both with us today. Thank you. Certainly, we invited you because we believe you're both individuals that are recognizing the need to get started whilst keeping an eye to how we improve. And I think that's exactly the mindset we need to bring to this. And so thank you both for being here and bringing your perspectives and experience with this question of measuring S. So I'd like to start really in this first area of measuring S conduct. As I said, we had a great deal about this crystallizing of what good conduct looks like from the perspective of social performance. And Martha, I'll start with you. And you've recently started to pilot and think about how you measure human rights performance within the company. And to my understanding, I think that starts in a really interesting place, right, which is about just supporting good internal knowledge and decision making, particularly at the level of the board. So I'd love to invite you to share. I think you have a few slides. So please just share your approach here and how you're beginning to think about this measurement for S performance.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you all for hosting this very important and timely conversation. I think a lot of us, struggle with exactly the thing we're talking about today. What is really good S performance? And at least Equinor, as an energy company, we have a lot of climate disclosures and also a lot of safety disclosures, and that's kind of been right front and center. And then obviously we all recognize that the S also needs some care and love. And for us in Equinor, we try to kind of build on these other areas where we are more advanced in terms of performance. And obviously the company is eager to see more quantitative measurements within this area. So that's the starting point. And I think we all recognize that what gets measured gets done. That's quite a typical I guess culture, and that's why it's also important to kind of try to engage in this journey. And of course you see an iceberg here, and you see 4 pillars. When it comes to human rights, we have tried to think about the all the elements of performance in terms of leadership. You need leadership in order for people to do the risk assessments and the human rights due diligence. And you need to, do that due diligence and kind of monitor and track that. And I guess any company will have partners and suppliers that are vital in terms of getting to outcomes too. So you want to start to kind of track how they are performing in your ecosystem. And then obviously we all have different kind of material issues, salient issues that we need to deal with. And you want to see, how you go about assessing those. So we're trying to build this framework, Mark, and starting small and then kind of learn as we go. And I think that is at least one thing we're, seeing, that we should not at all aim for perfect here. It's just, get going with something that you think will create change. And that's how we have kind of gone about thinking about it. Plus, of course, something that you actually can measure. So, that's just some initial reflections, Mark.
Yeah, please feel free, Martha, to share your next slide on sort of the maturity process that you're going through here around your measurement.
Sure. And as you see here, crawl before you can run. And I think, again, do not aim for perfect. We certainly do not aim for perfect, but we are really trying to think about how to start with the most important things, the most salient issues, and what you actually can measure, and try to not, again, boil the ocean, but think that this is actually a journey, and you will probably learn as you start measuring something, and you probably will see if it works, if it kind of leads to some new kind of effects that you then want to kind of start digging into. So of course you want to become more and more what should I say, you want to cover a broader set of your human rights work. And you also, of course, want to go from kind of the processes, the due diligence, the risk assessment to the outcomes that we will talk more about soon.
Thank you, Marta, very much. And I'm struck by how just with your internal framework to recognize the different things you need to have in place internally to get a handle of conduct, right? And it resonates, your framework actually quite neatly, I find, with that sort of TCFD-based approach, right? When we think about, this is also about governance and strategy. And of course, it's relevant that ISSB is taking that approach, and also it's resonant with GRI. Also really appreciated that comment you made about moving from, I suppose, a kind of paper compliance approach to quality of process, and how do we get there? And I certainly hear from conversations with individuals in C-suites, most recently with a lot of CFOs, that we cannot just get stuck on paper compliance here, but so how do we move forward there? So really appreciate that vision of maturing on that conduct piece. Nikolai, I would love to turn to you. We've heard a bit on the last webinar about growth in reporting and regulatory convergence around due diligence. I'd just love you to give the perspective from the investor lens. As to what are investors, though, looking at? Is that convergence playing out in the investor space? And particularly, what do you think is the current reality and the paths forward for maturing also investor approaches to thinking about this question of S conduct?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I appreciate being here discussing this topic with you today. So just a line about the PRI for those not familiar with us. We're a global investor membership organization that is supported by the UN with more than 4,000 members. So that's essentially the majority of institutional capital. So my comments today are going to be across exactly what investors do, both in terms of the investment process, how they undertake active ownership or stewardship, but also in the role that the PRI plays in terms of regulation that you just highlighted, Mark. So just to start with, when we think about social issues at the PRI, we think about human rights as the foundation. And I think that reflects the conversation you've had earlier in the week. So what are the important standards here? For us, it's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, as well as the specific guidance they've made for institutional investors. So these frameworks and the way they're set out for investors is also about governance. It's about risk management, tracking and disclosure. So these are the things that we're increasingly seeing investors doing as well. In fact, in the PRI's own reporting framework, so that's an exercise that all of our members undertake on an annual basis. They report to us in terms of their practices. We could see last year that about 20% of our signatories are now using these international frameworks. That may not sound like a lot, it certainly isn't a majority, but it's a big jump on the past year, almost doubling in percentage terms. So it does indicate to us a clear trend. Now there's really big variation from a regional perspective in these numbers. I think it will be unsurprising to most that a much larger share of investors in Europe are undertaking these practices. And that kind of takes us back to the regulation point, because in Europe, not only recently with what is called the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is a disclosure regulation for investors, which uses also these international standards that I just mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles. It talks about principal adverse impacts. That puts this responsibility on investors. But actually, if we go even further back, for example, in Denmark, in accounting standards for almost a decade, institutional investors of a certain size, for example, pension funds, have been mandated to report on human rights. So there is a longer tradition here, which is why we likely see more investors in this jurisdiction undertaking these practices. But nonetheless, it's a trend that's more global in nature. So then the question is, what does this mean then, this trend and this regulation and these practices from an investor point of view? Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that there's quite a spectrum here. Investors is not one homogeneous group. They have different investment strategies. They invest in different types of companies in different regions. and in different times of the life cycle of a company's growth phase, if you will. Like, for example, I've just been on a call earlier today with private equity investors where we were discussing exactly this topic, like preventing and mitigating efforts. And those investors have a lot more ability to have in-depth conversations because they have higher ownership shares. They may even have management positions on boards, and therefore they can go much more in depth. A lot of other investors who are more diversified will hold thousands, if not tens of thousands of companies in their portfolio. And so the resources they have relative to their companies is just fund managers. And that means they make use of commercial service providers, such as data providers, for example. I think people on the call may be aware of this, but there has been some studies on the sort of S scores of these service providers, that they are sort of east and west. You can get everything from those scores. So investors do tend to look underneath the hood and do their own sort of in-house assessment. But also these data providers are increasingly starting to use the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and OECD guidelines. So this whole focus on process and governance and risk management in their products and services. Now, this also reflects the regulation. So in Europe, for example, people may be familiar with the taxonomy regulation, which tries to sort of categorize what's sustainable from an environmental point of view. But there are social provisions here that makes it clear that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines are the standards. And that obviously means that investors and the service providers are starting to go more down that path when they think about social performance. So essentially, this is about risk prevention. We'll come back, I think, in a second to talk about what happens when the issue has already occurred. But in essence, investors are obviously keen to avoid risks, because once they manifest themselves, the social damage is done, but also the financial damage. So yeah, there are a lot of sort of developments in the commercial space. I maybe just want to highlight before I finish, Mark, is also that there are, of course, non-commercial organizations that provides insights for investors. The World Benchmarking Alliance would be an example that you mentioned, that was mentioned in the introduction, and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. These organizations are known also for using the exact same standards. So I wanted to mention that as well to complete the picture, that there is certainly in the commercial space, the non-commercial space, from the regulators, from the investors, there is a very clear trend down that path.
Thank you, Nikolai. So just to tease it out, that I'm hearing sort of a bit of resonance with what Marta's saying there about this need to start somewhere around that sort of policy process conduct, but also investors beginning to, because they're sort of focusing on this conduct and sometimes required to focus on this conduct of companies, attentiveness to that sort of governance, boards overseeing these issues. Is there evidence of that? Evidence of embeddedness in strategy, the same way we have on climate, on processes, whether we do hear more, I think, about whether stakeholders are meaningfully engaged in that type of risk management. And so I know those are kind of themes that you've been pushing a lot with your PRI members as well, to figure out how they build in that, those questions of quality that Marta spoke to, that we need to sort of mature to a little bit as well. So thank you both for that. Let's turn our attention a bit. Let's get into this question of outcomes, right? Of course, these two things of conduct and outcome are not divorced, right? What we need to do is see them together. Some people may be quite familiar with the sort of leading, lagging indicator type framework. It's a little bit like that in this context, right? Where we need to see outcomes be driven and see quality of process that's likely to lead to good outcomes. And so, Marta, I wonder if you could just give us a very sort of grounded example of how you're thinking about sort of one issue and how to really measure outcomes in that regard. I know you focus a fair amount on forced labor as one of your salient issues. So could you just talk us through how you're going about that? It's very concrete in a very practical way, just to unpack what this might look like in a specific issue that needs to get managed by the company.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So obviously, the whole S field is quite wide. So Equinor, as I mentioned earlier, already reports and tracks, other parts of the S being workforce data, HSE, diversity, gender pay gaps, and all of that. So I think that is probably easier to grasp for most. It's maybe already quite much more mature in terms of being quantitative and having industry standards. So I just wanted to say that. So we do a lot of that already. Now, when it comes to our human rights performance framework, we have kind of decided to focus on labor issues and forced labor in our supply chains, and that's because it's a salient issue for us. And we've done, just being us and our kind of activities, it is a salient issue. But we have also identified it to actually be a real issue on the ground. So that is why we have kind of focused a lot of our the performance framework thinking and indicators around that. Of course, because there's an issue, we need to resolve it. So you have traction on it. And then it's easier also to think about, okay, what leading indicators do you need to kind of look at in order to help the kind of the situation on the ground. So on forced labor, we have kind of identified a few issues. You might know there's 11 forced labor indicators. There's certain issues that we have come across many times. So we've decided let's focus on that in terms of counting number of people who have been found to be subject of, for a certain forced labor indicator, for instance, recruitment fees, passport retention, to name a couple. And then obviously you also want to measure, so what did we do with that? So that's the real outcomes for people. So remediation of recruitment fees, passports, given back. So obviously, in order to be able to track these things, you need to be on the ground. And that's, of course, the key thing. So we have invested, particularly in this area, to get facts from the ground. And then, of course, we are able to track both the findings and the outcomes as long as we do follow through. And when you do that, you can also start to look at, okay, how long time did it take to do the remediation, which is quite meaningful, again, to kind of push for, better performance internally. So we've done that. And last year, or actually in the annual report that we presented this year for last year, we disclosed figures around this. So both findings and outcomes, and we also try to kind of contextualize it. Why are we disclosing this? And we believe that, disclosing that type of data shows that the company has actually done something real, instead of saying we've done a lot of assessments or we have trained people, because that doesn't necessarily lead to anything. So we believe that, showing that there are issues there and that you've done something with it kind of is one way of evidencing that you have done a thorough human rights due diligence process and actually try to live by your commitment. And I think I see Evan here has a question on, what is the incentive for kind of disclosing these kind of uncomfortable things. And I think it's just that, because we believe that is what you need to do to show that you are kind of, putting in a real effort. And then obviously, these types of data, nobody likes that. So it again pushes performance internally. And we finally, I can also mention that, of course, when we did this disclosure, we were a bit concerned about the reactions. So we have only had positive reactions to it, including from the government in Norway, who recently adopted a new legislation, and we kind of showed this example. Is this good disclosure? And they said this is exactly what we believe is good disclosure. So I think it's not necessarily as kind of dangerous as you would think. We all have these issues, so let's just be kind of open about it.
Thank you, Marta. That's great. And thank you for picking up a question as well. And absolutely, I think this mindset shift from companies shouldn't have problems to we all have challenges across our value chains in our communities. How are we evidencing, addressing them? And I was, recently noted that the Johannesburg Stock Exchange released its sustainability guidance. And actually the indicators it puts around forced labor and child labor are very different from where they've been for the last decade, when it actually calls out not only whether you've identified issues, but whether you've played a role in remediating them, and asks for percentages of those. And so I think this idea of leaning into evidence of problem solving and finding solutions is really where we're at now in terms of looking at outcomes. And so thank you for that very concrete example, which made me think about that leadership as well from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Nicola, I would like to turn to you for a few minutes and just if you could kind of again zoom out a little bit and give your take on how an investor thinks about or is trying to lean into this question of outcomes, right? And give your sense of where we are and where you think the gaps are and where we are and where you think we need to get to. So over to you to give that investor perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that example that Marta just gave was excellent, because I fully agree that's the type of openness and sort of a proactive conversation we want to have on these issues. I think it's fair to say that this has not always historically been the way that investors and their service providers have looked at these issues. So there has been a certain practice of sort of identifying controversies. Sometimes I think they were referred to as UN Global Compact screens. So finding certain incidents in media or via civil society reports was then an indication of a company's poor practice. So that was taken to sort of indicate what are ultimately the outcomes of a given company's practices. Now, of course, that is just, I mean, first of all, the information you get in different regions, different sectors, depending on size, there's a lot of inequalities in that. And also exactly for what we've just been discussing, it potentially hampers the openness of companies if that's the way you go about looking at social performance. So that's certainly something we want to move away from. And I actually think there's a good example on the way now, using Europe again as an example. And that's just because I've had the pleasure of participating in a working group that was advising the European Commission on how to understand this clause I mentioned before in the regulation around minimum social and governance safeguards. So a way in which investors and their service providers can assess this performance, and a way in which companies can document. And there we still use the advice is we still use these incidents that are being reported, but in more formal means. So for example, if there are court cases, or if there is a case on the OECD has these national contact points that deals with cases of potential issues of practices of companies, or it could be the Business and Human Rights Resource Center that I mentioned before that has an allegation database. But then the key determining factor becomes not whether a company has a case, but how it responds to the case. So do they decide not to participate in a constructive process through the OECD, for example, or do they decide to ignore or not engage in an allegation that's raised against them? Well, then that is a good sign of let's say performance or practice that's not up to par with what we would expect under the UN guiding principles, but it doesn't become the issue in the first place. So hopefully it should be much more sort of focused on problem solving, if you will. Now, if I can move into the second aspect, which actually the EU has also been looking at when we talk about impacts and outcomes, it's sort of in a more positive vein, if you will. There's sort of three different groups that we typically consider when we talk about the social dimension, and that's the workforce, it's the communities, and then consumers and end users, obviously considering a value chain of all these three groups. And the workers dimension is obviously where we tend to have the better information. There are contractual relationships between the employer and the workers. There is better kept information, and often it's sort of quantitative in nature, but that's not always true for the other aspects. So I think I'll refrain from going into a philosophical discussion about sort of the differences between climate and human rights, but we cannot always get to the same point on human rights. Maybe we can come back to that later. So yeah, better information on the workers, but still gaps, and that holds true for the other stakeholder groups as well. The second bit that's interesting to think about, which I think has not been so common in the sort of mainstream investment space, it's more in the realm of development finance institutions and so forward, is the way in which companies contribute to areas that are considered public good. So these are more sector dependent, but companies that contribute, for example, in the healthcare space, in education, in housing, in infrastructure, it could be telecommunication, these types of things. I think we can be much better at sort of sharing information around the way in which companies, the private sector, contribute to the goals that we have at a national level or a regional level. So that's something some of these benchmarks institutions are putting a spotlight on as well. For example, access to medicine would be one good example of how the pharmaceutical sector contributes to that. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that for now, Mark.
Thank you, Nikolai. And I think that also connects back to some of the things that Vincent from the OECD DUIs was talking in the previous webinar around well-being frameworks and the ways in which we can move from how do we look at some of these management of risk driving problems in very difficult places to then looking at how those are contributions to some of those frameworks that governments use.